What happens when power becomes more important than biology? For centuries, royal families across the world believed that keeping their bloodlines pure would strengthen their dynasties. But instead of producing stronger heirs, they created generations of rulers plagued by deformities, mental instability, and deadly genetic disorders. From King Tutankhamun's fragile bones to Charles II of Spain's inability to function as a ruler, history is filled with tragic examples of how inbreeding backfired. It shaped the fate of empires, led to unexpected political consequences, and in some cases, contributed to the collapse of entire royal houses. But why did so many monarchs ignore the warning signs? How did royal inbreeding influence some of history's most significant events? And are there still consequences of these practices lingering in the modern world? Let's dive in. From ancient Egypt to European dynasties, inbreeding produced kings and queens who were riddled with disease, suffering from deformities, mental instability, and at times, unimaginable pain. They believed they were creating stronger heirs, but in reality, they were engineering some of the most tragic figures in history. One of the earliest and most well-known cases of royal inbreeding is found in ancient Egypt. The pharaohs, who were considered living gods, believed that their blood was too divine to mix with commoners. As a result, they frequently married their own siblings, thinking this would preserve their sacred lineage. But preserving pure blood came at a heavy cost. Take King Tutankhamun, for example. Tut, as he is commonly known, ruled Egypt over 3,000 years ago. His father, Pharaoh Akhenaten, took the tradition of royal inbreeding to an extreme, marrying his own sister. Tutankhamun was the result of this union, and his short life was defined by the devastating effects of this genetic gamble. When researchers examined Tutankhamun's remains using deoxyribonucleic acid testing, they discovered a long list of disorders. His bones were weak, his spine was curved, and his feet were so severely deformed that walking was painful. Modern scientists diagnosed him with Kohler's disease, a rare condition that causes bones in the feet to collapse. He also suffered from scoliosis and had a clubfoot, making it nearly impossible for him to stand unaided. Historians say he likely spent most of his life relying on a cane. Over 130 walking sticks were found in his tomb. Beyond his physical ailments, King Tut's facial structure was also affected. His skull had an elongated shape and he had a severe overbite, a trait seen in many inbred royals throughout history. His early death at the age of 19 was likely caused by a combination of genetic weakness and a leg fracture that became infected. In the end, the divine bloodline that his ancestors worked so hard to preserve ultimately led to his downfall. But Egypt wasn't the only civilization that fell into the trap of inbreeding. Thousands of years later, European monarchies followed a similar path. They too believed that marrying within their own ranks would secure their power, but as we now know, it came with severe consequences. Among the worst cases of royal inbreeding in European history was the Habsburg dynasty, a family so obsessed with keeping the throne within their bloodline that they married close relatives for generations. The Habsburgs ruled over Spain, Austria, and much of Europe for centuries, and their genetic legacy is one of the most infamous in history. By the 15th century, members of the family were already showing signs of genetic defects. Their distinctive feature, known as the Habsburg jaw, was an exaggerated underbite that became more pronounced with each generation. This condition, known today as mandibular prognathism, made speaking and eating difficult. One of the earliest royals to show extreme signs of the Habsburg jaw was Philip IV of Spain. His lower jaw was so large that he could barely close his mouth, and his speech was often slurred. Despite these warning signs, the family continued its inbreeding traditions. But it was Charles II of Spain, born in 1661, who suffered the worst fate. Charles was the unfortunate result of multiple generations of inbreeding, with his parents being uncle and niece. The effects were devastating. He was physically deformed, mentally impaired, and so sickly that many believed he wouldn't survive childhood. His tongue was so enlarged that he could barely speak, and he didn't learn to walk until he was 8 years old. As he grew older, his condition worsened. He suffered from epilepsy, struggled with constant illness, and was completely infertile, a disastrous outcome for a king whose primary duty was to produce an heir. His autopsy report is shocking, even by today's standards. It was recorded that Charles II had no blood in his body. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his intestines were rotting, and his skull was filled with water. He had just one testicle, which was described as being black as coal. His condition was so severe that historians believe he was the most inbred royal in European history. Charles's tragic life was a turning point for the Habsburg dynasty. His inability to produce an heir led to the War of the Spanish Succession, a major conflict that reshaped Europe. The Spanish branch of the Habsburgs came to an end, but their genetic legacy lived on in other royal families across the continent. As European monarchies expanded their power, inbreeding became even more common, with cousin marriages becoming the norm. The House of Hanover in England was no exception. For centuries, they intermarried to keep their lineage strong. But like the Habsburgs, they paid a heavy price. One of the most famous victims of inbreeding in British history was King George III. Born in 1738, George was not expected to survive. He was born 2 months premature and was sickly throughout his childhood. Despite this, he grew into adulthood and became one of England's longest-reigning monarchs. But his reign was overshadowed by a condition that would define him in history: madness. For most of his life, George was plagued by a mysterious illness that caused episodes of insanity. He would go through periods of extreme paranoia, speak uncontrollably for hours, and suffer from violent convulsions. His condition worsened with age, and by the early 1800s, he was permanently confined to his chambers. He lost his sight, his hearing, and eventually his grip on reality. Modern scientists believe that George III suffered from porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that causes severe pain, mental disturbances, and in some cases, blue-colored urine. The disorder is believed to have been a direct result of generations of inbreeding within the House of Hanover. By the time George was officially declared insane, he no longer recognized his own family. His final years were spent in isolation, locked away from the public eye. His madness had political consequences as well. His erratic behavior led to the loss of the American colonies, a defining moment in world history. Had George been of sound mind, would the United States have gained independence when it did? It's impossible to say, but one thing is certain. Royal inbreeding didn't just affect individuals, it changed the course of nations. As the 18th century progressed, the pattern of inbreeding continued. Even as medical knowledge advanced, royal families still clung to outdated traditions, setting the stage for more tragedies in the centuries to come. For centuries, royalty across the world believed that keeping bloodlines pure would strengthen their rule. They thought that by marrying within their own families, they could preserve their power, wealth, and divine status. But what they didn't realize was that this practice was gradually weakening them, not just politically, but biologically. The consequences of royal inbreeding were often horrific, leading to physical deformities, severe illnesses, and even mental instability. The pursuit of purity came at a devastating cost, and few dynasties experienced its consequences as severely as the Habsburgs. Charles II of Spain was perhaps the most extreme example of royal inbreeding in European history. His parents, Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece, and the generations of intermarriage before them meant that Charles was more genetically inbred than if his parents had been siblings. The result was a man who was physically weak, intellectually stunted, and incapable of ruling. His jaw was so deformed that he struggled to chew and speak properly. He had difficulty walking, suffered from constant illnesses, and was infertile, an enormous problem for a monarch expected to produce an heir. His rule was plagued by instability, and his early death at the age of 39 marked the end of the Spanish Habsburg line. But the Habsburgs weren't the only ones who suffered from the effects of inbreeding. In England, the royal family had its own problems. King George III, who ruled from the late 18th to early 19th century, is often remembered as the Mad King who lost America. He suffered from repeated bouts of mental illness, which caused erratic behavior, uncontrollable speech, and extreme paranoia. Historians have debated the cause of his condition for years, with one theory suggesting that he suffered from porphyria, a genetic disorder that can cause neurological problems and turn urine blue. Others believe his illness may have been bipolar disorder, worsened by the inbreeding within the House of Hanover. Regardless of the cause, his decline was severe. By the early 1800s, he was no longer able to rule, and his son had to take over as Prince Regent. He spent his final years in seclusion, blind, deaf, and lost in his own mind. Even as Europe entered the 19th century, royal families continued to marry within their own bloodlines, believing it was their duty to maintain dynastic strength. But with each generation, the genetic weaknesses became harder to ignore. One of the most devastating examples of this was the spread of hemophilia, known as the royal disease. Queen Victoria of England unknowingly became a carrier of the disorder, which prevents blood from clotting properly. Since she and Prince Albert, her husband, were first cousins, their children had a high likelihood of inheriting the gene. When Victoria's daughters married into other European royal families, the disease spread across the continent. Her great-grandson, Tsarevich Alexei of Russia, was one of the most well-known victims. As the heir to the Russian Empire, his health was a closely guarded secret. A simple fall or minor injury could cause life-threatening internal bleeding, and the family was desperate to keep him alive. Their reliance on the mystic healer Rasputin to treat his condition only fueled political unrest, and many believe that Alexei's illness contributed to the fall of the Romanov dynasty. Other royal men, including Prince Leopold of Britain, Prince Friedrich of Germany, and two Spanish princes, also died young from hemophilia-related complications. As the 19th century progressed, some royal families began to recognize the dangers of inbreeding. But for others, tradition was hard to break. In Thailand, King Chulalongkorn, one of the country's most revered rulers, married 4 of his half-sisters. He fathered an astonishing number of children, over 70 in total. While many lived long lives, others were plagued by health problems. In the Hawaiian monarchy, Princess Nahianaina was pressured to marry her own brother to maintain royal blood purity. Their child died shortly after birth, and the princess herself fell into deep despair, dying not long after. By the end of the 19th century, the effects of royal inbreeding were undeniable. The once powerful Habsburg dynasty had collapsed. The British and Russian royal families were struggling with inherited diseases, and monarchies across the world were beginning to face the consequences of centuries of intermarriage. The world was changing, and soon so too would the traditions that had shaped royal families for generations. By the end of the 19th century, the consequences of royal inbreeding were impossible to ignore. Dynasties that had ruled for centuries were now suffering from the genetic weaknesses they had unknowingly cultivated through generations of intermarriage. Some families had already paid the price, while others were just beginning to feel its effects. Hemophilia, known as the royal disease, was spreading through European monarchies. Deformities were becoming more pronounced, and mental illness was creeping into the highest ranks of nobility. Yet, despite these warning signs, many royal houses continued to cling to tradition, convinced that their bloodlines needed to remain pure. The most tragic example of the royal disease was Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich of Russia. Born in 1904 as the youngest child of Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra, Alexei was the heir to the Russian throne. But he carried a deadly secret. His mother, Alexandra, was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria and a carrier of hemophilia. The gene had spread across Europe due to Victoria's numerous descendants, and Alexei had inherited the full-blown disorder. Unlike the other royal children who suffered from it, Alexei's condition was particularly severe. His blood failed to clot properly, meaning that even the smallest bruise or cut could lead to internal bleeding that was nearly impossible to stop. In a desperate attempt to manage their son's condition, the royal family turned to a controversial figure, Grigory Rasputin. A self-proclaimed holy man, Rasputin claimed he could heal Alexei through prayer and hypnosis. Whether or not his methods had any real medical effect is still debated, but the boy's health seemed to improve whenever Rasputin was involved. This only deepened the Tsarina's reliance on him, which in turn fueled political unrest. The Russian public saw Rasputin as a manipulative fraud whose influence over the royal family was dangerous. As discontent grew, so did opposition to the monarchy, eventually culminating in the Russian Revolution. The fall of the Romanovs wasn't solely caused by Alexei's condition. but it played a significant role in weakening the public's faith in the ruling family. Hemophilia was not the only genetic disorder affecting European royals. The Habsburgs had already suffered greatly from centuries of inbreeding, but by the 19th century, their genetic defects had become more pronounced. While Charles II of Spain had been their most extreme case, later generations continued to bear the physical and mental consequences of marrying too closely within their own bloodline. The Austrian branch of the family, which controlled the Austro-Hungarian Empire, still showed signs of the infamous Habsburg jaw. The lower jaw was so pronounced in some family members that it interfered with their ability to chew properly, and in certain cases, their speech was severely affected. But the Habsburgs weren't the only family to experience mental instability. The Portuguese royal family, which had followed similar patterns of intermarriage, suffered devastating effects as well. Queen Maria I of Portugal, who ruled from 1777 to 1816, is remembered as one of the most mentally unstable monarchs in history. She married her uncle, continuing the cycle of inbreeding that had already affected her predecessors. As she grew older, her mental condition deteriorated rapidly. She experienced frequent fits of hysteria, became increasingly paranoid, and would spend hours screaming in anguish for no apparent reason. After the deaths of her husband and eldest son, her condition worsened. She was eventually declared insane and spent the final years of her life confined to her chambers, unable to function as a ruler. Inbreeding's impact wasn't limited to Europe. In the Middle East, royal families had also engaged in cousin marriages for centuries. By the early 20th century, the effects of prolonged consanguinity, marriage between blood relatives, began to manifest in the region. One of the most striking cases was that of King Saud of Saudi Arabia, who ruled from 1953 to 1964. Born into a dynasty where cousin marriages were common, King Saud struggled with severe health problems throughout his life. He suffered from obesity, diabetes, and neurological issues, which eventually led to his abdication. While his health problems cannot be entirely blamed on inbreeding, they highlight a growing concern in the region about the genetic risks associated with these marriages. By the early 20th century, scientific advancements were beginning to shed light on the dangers of inbreeding. As medical research progressed, it became increasingly clear that continuing to marry within the same bloodline led to an increased risk of genetic disorders. The rise of eugenics, a now widely discredited movement, brought further attention to hereditary conditions among royal families. While eugenics itself was deeply flawed and often misused for unethical purposes, it did contribute to discussions about the importance of genetic diversity. Despite these warnings, inbreeding continued in certain royal circles. In Japan, the imperial family had practiced cousin marriages for centuries, though they eventually abandoned the tradition in the late 20th century. Meanwhile, in the Arab world, cousin marriages remained widely accepted, particularly in Saudi Arabia, where studies found that nearly 45% of marriages were between relatives. This led to an increase in hereditary disorders, including hemoglobin deficiencies, spinal muscular atrophy, and metabolic conditions. The world was changing rapidly, and monarchies had to adapt or face extinction. As more scientific research emerged, many royal families began looking outside their immediate bloodlines for suitable partners. But for those who had already suffered the effects of inbreeding, the damage was irreversible. The genetic weaknesses that had been passed down for generations could not be undone, and the legacies of these once great dynasties were permanently marked by the choices of their ancestors. By the early 20th century, the consequences of royal inbreeding were widely recognized, yet in some regions, the tradition continued. While European dynasties began marrying outside their immediate families to avoid further genetic damage, others were reluctant to break the custom. The damage, however, had already been done. The effects of centuries of intermarriage could not be undone overnight, and for some royal families, the price they paid for their obsession with blood purity would continue to haunt them. The British royal family, which had once played a major role in spreading hemophilia across European monarchies, took a different approach. By the mid-20th century, they had distanced themselves from close familial marriages, recognizing the potential risks. However, the scars left behind by generations of inbreeding remained evident. Prince Leopold, one of Queen Victoria's sons, had suffered from hemophilia and died at just 31 after a minor fall resulted in a fatal brain hemorrhage. The disease had also taken the lives of several of Victoria's other descendants, including her great-grandsons in Russia, Spain, and Germany. While the direct effects of inbreeding faded over time as outbreeding became the norm, the genetic weaknesses that had been passed down through generations could not be completely erased. In Austria, the Habsburg dynasty had already collapsed, but its effects were still visible in one of its most famous figures, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi. Born into the heavily inbred Wittelsbach family, Sisi was known for her striking beauty but suffered from severe mental health issues. She experienced long bouts of depression, became obsessive about her appearance, and developed an eating disorder that left her dangerously thin. Her fragile mental state only worsened over time, leading her to isolate herself from the royal court. Despite her attempts to escape the pressures of royal life, her tragic fate was sealed when she was assassinated in 1998 by an anarchist in Switzerland. Though her death was not directly linked to inbreeding, the psychological struggles she endured were consistent with those observed in other inbred European royals. Even as Europe moved away from inbreeding, in other parts of the world the practice remained common. In the Middle East, cousin marriages continued to be widely accepted, particularly among the ruling families of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and other Gulf states. While these marriages were often seen as a way to preserve wealth and power within the family, they also led to an increased prevalence of genetic disorders. By the 21st century, studies conducted in Saudi Arabia found that nearly half of all marriages in the country were between blood relatives. The results were alarming: higher rates of hemoglobin deficiencies, congenital heart defects, and neurological disorders. In the United States, a different kind of inbreeding story emerged. While royal families had historically practiced intermarriage for political reasons, isolated communities in rural America saw inbreeding occur due to a lack of outside genetic diversity. The most well-known case was that of the Fugate family of Kentucky. Living in an isolated region of Appalachia, the family intermarried for generations, leading to a rare genetic condition called methemoglobinemia. This disorder caused their skin to appear blue due to a lack of oxygen in the blood. For decades, the blue people of Kentucky were a medical mystery, until researchers discovered that their condition was the direct result of inbreeding within the small community. Unlike the royal families of Europe and the Middle East, their condition was not a result of a deliberate strategy to maintain power, but rather a consequence of geographic isolation. As genetic research advanced, many governments began to take steps to address the risks of inbreeding. In some countries, premarital genetic screening programs were introduced to help couples assess the likelihood of passing on hereditary disorders. In Saudi Arabia, such programs were implemented to reduce the incidence of genetic diseases caused by cousin marriages. In other parts of the world, cultural shifts led to a natural decline in consanguineous marriages as younger generations prioritized health over tradition. Despite these changes, the legacy of royal inbreeding remains a fascinating yet cautionary tale. The belief that pure bloodlines ensured stronger rulers ultimately proved to be a catastrophic mistake. The suffering endured by monarchs like Charles II of Spain, King George III of England, and Tsarevich Alexei of Russia serves as a grim reminder of the consequences of ignoring basic genetic principles. As the modern world moves further away from the traditions of the past, the concept of royal inbreeding has become more of a historical curiosity than an ongoing practice. However, its impact on history is undeniable. The decisions made by royal families centuries ago did not just shape their own lineages. They influenced the course of entire nations, from the downfall of the Habsburg Empire to the Russian Revolution. Though the days of intermarrying royals may be behind us, the genetic markers left behind by centuries of inbreeding still linger in the DNA of some of the world's most powerful bloodlines. History has shown that no amount of wealth or status can protect a family from the biological consequences of ignoring genetic diversity. It is a lesson learned the hard way by some of history's most powerful rulers, and one that continues to shape the way we understand genetics today. By the time the 21st century arrived, royal inbreeding had largely faded into history. The rigid traditions that once dictated whom a monarch could marry had been set aside in favor of more diverse unions, ensuring that genetic weaknesses did not continue to be passed down. However, the consequences of centuries of intermarriage were already deeply embedded in the histories of some of the world's most powerful dynasties. The effects were still visible, not just in medical records but also in the legacies left behind by those who suffered because of it. The downfall of royal houses like the Habsburgs, the Romanovs, and the Spanish Bourbons was not solely caused by genetic weakness, but it was undeniably a factor. Charles II of Spain was so physically and mentally unfit to rule that his inability to produce an heir led to the War of the Spanish Succession, which redrew the political landscape of Europe. The tragic health struggles of Tsarevich Alexei weakened the Russian monarchy's grip on power, as his mother's desperation to keep him alive allowed Rasputin's influence to grow unchecked. King George III's bouts of insanity, believed by many to have been exacerbated by inbreeding, contributed to political instability in Britain at a crucial time, leading to the loss of the American colonies. Yet, despite these cautionary tales, inbreeding did not completely disappear. In some cultures, particularly in the Middle East and parts of South Asia, cousin marriages remain common. Unlike European royalty, where inbreeding was primarily a strategy to consolidate power, these marriages are often rooted in cultural tradition. In Saudi Arabia, studies show that nearly half of all marriages are between cousins, a practice that has been linked to a higher prevalence of genetic disorders such as sickle cell anemia, thalassemia, and various metabolic conditions. Although governments have introduced genetic screening programs to mitigate these risks, change has been slow, as breaking deep-seated traditions takes time. Even outside of royalty, history has shown that isolated populations can face similar genetic consequences. The case of the Fugate family in Kentucky, whose generations of intermarriage led to a rare condition that turned their skin blue, is one example. In remote parts of the world where populations have limited genetic diversity, disorders caused by recessive genes are more likely to manifest. Modern medicine and genetic research have helped mitigate some of these risks, but the historical lessons from royal inbreeding serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of ignoring genetic variation. As the world evolved, so too did the concept of monarchy. Modern royals now marry for love rather than duty, and strict rules about noble bloodlines have mostly faded. In the British royal family, Prince Charles married Diana Spencer, a woman without aristocratic roots, and their children went on to marry commoners as well. In other countries, such as Japan, royals have even given up their titles in order to marry outside of the aristocracy. These changes reflect a shift not just in cultural values, but also in an understanding of the importance of genetic diversity. The story of royal inbreeding is one of power, ambition, and unintended consequences. For centuries, monarchs believed they were strengthening their dynasties by keeping their bloodlines pure, but in reality they were slowly weakening them. The physical deformities, genetic disorders, and mental illnesses that plagued generations of royal families were not random misfortunes. They were the result of deliberate choices made by their ancestors. Today, we have a much greater understanding of genetics and the importance of diversity in maintaining a healthy population. Science has allowed us to identify the risks associated with inbreeding and develop measures to prevent them. The history of royal inbreeding serves as a reminder that no amount of wealth or status can override the laws of biology. While modern monarchies may no longer engage in the same practices that once defined their ancestors, the lessons of history remain. The consequences of royal inbreeding were not just felt by the individuals who suffered from its effects. They shaped the course of nations, altered the fate of empires, and, in some cases, contributed to the collapse of entire dynasties. It is a sobering reminder that decisions made in pursuit of power can have lasting consequences, ones that cannot always be undone. As history moves forward, the remnants of these once powerful dynasties remain, not just in the form of grand palaces and historical records, but in the very DNA of those who descend from them. The genetic legacy of royal inbreeding is still present, a hidden reminder of a time when bloodlines were valued above all else. But in the end, history has shown that true strength does not come from purity. It comes from diversity, adaptability, and the ability to learn from the mistakes of the past. With that, we have reached the end of today's video. If you have come that far with us, be sure to check out other videos on the channel.